We brought those internal conflicts on ourselves through mass migration. And of course, that's also a convenient tool of control. When there's unrest inside a country, it's easier to shape things from above. The so-called elites we have now, they've been carefully selected, cast, and conditioned. I'm still glad that things turned out the way they did, but I'm deeply disappointed at the same time. What really matters is that people can still climb to the next level somehow. But in today's society, that's impossible for many people in the United States, and in Germany too. We've reached a level of inequality that's really damaging for society as a whole, and Trump didn't deliver on that. That means people are basically moving out of the dollar and buying raw materials instead. China is getting ready for a world that keeps breaking apart economically. So, where is change supposed to come from now? And the political elites in Germany, well, many of them grew up with this international narrative. Maybe after a hard economic landing, new perspectives will open up. Right now, I don't see where that could come from.
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person.
Against the Current. About the guest. Hello and welcome to Against the Current. We present viewpoints and perspectives that the propaganda media prefer to ignore. His doctoral advisor was none other than Ben Bernanke, who later became the head of the U.S. Federal Reserve. He earned his Ph.D. on German foreign policy, works as a fund manager, economist, and political activist. Back then, he was still a member of the CDU, later a candidate for the office of federal president for the AfD, and he has a gift for explaining economics in a way anyone can understand. Welcome, Professor Max Otte. Thank you very much, Mr. Baab. You said earlier, in my dissertation, I predicted what's happening today. Can you explain that to me?
I saw it coming. I gave a small warning at the time. It wasn't a full prediction, but you could see it. So that dissertation, it was actually my second attempt. At some point, I changed the topic. The dissertation dealt with German foreign policy and the changes after reunification. I wrote it between 1992 and 1996, and in 94 came the first phase of NATO's eastward expansion. One chapter focused on the question of whether NATO or the OSCE should take the lead, how a new European security architecture with Germany at its center should look. Even back then, I said NATO would probably prevail, meaning that, if in doubt, Germany would follow NATO's lead. And after the first round of NATO's eastward expansion, I already said, if we keep going like this, and this wasn't what we had promised Russia, it will eventually violate Russia's legitimate security interests. And then we'll face serious problems, unrest, and maybe even war.
If German foreign policy follows the NATO line, why does it do that?
We Germans tend to have a strong belief in authority. And of course, we went through the catastrophe of the Second World War. Right after that war, something like a foreign policy doctrine emerged, something I write about, that basically left out the idea of German interests altogether. Or, whenever German interests were mentioned, they were always tied directly to NATO, alignment with the West, and European integration. So, my father's generation wanted a federal, subsidiary, democratic Europe. One person, one vote. But that's not what we have. What we have is an intergovernmental Europe, and NATO has been a fixed part of that doctrine since about 1955 or 56. And we've basically been trained not to think about German interests, not to think in terms of our own national interests. For me, even when I was young, it was always clear that you first define your national interest, and from that, alliances or other arrangements follow.
Und daraus folgen dann Bündnisse oder auch etwas anderes. Das steht ja völlig im Gegensatz.
That's completely at odds with Willy Brandt's government statement and his political approach. We wanted to be a nation of good neighbors, change through rapprochement, So there must have been some kind of break, a shift towards submission to the NATO concept.
Hin zur Unterwerfung unter das NATO-Konzept. Ich würde mal eher sagen, dass Willy Brandt der Bruch war. Oder
I'd
die
say Willy
Ausnahme.
Brandt was
Die
really the break,
Nachkriegszeit,
or maybe the
die
exception in the post-war
CDU
period.
Elternhaus,
His Ostpolitik, well, I grew up in a CDU household, a conservative Christian post-war family, so of course that policy toward the East was a big topic of debate. I was 6, 7, 8, maybe 9 years old at the time. It went on for quite a while. So yes, Willy Brandt was more the exception. Later on, I even had the chance to talk with Egon Bahr about those things. In the end, though, Adenauer, his successors, and later Helmut Schmidt as well, all followed the NATO line, and there were only a few who didn't.
Vertreten und da gab's nur wenige, sagen wir Ausnahmen.
Let's say exceptions or deviations from that. May I conclude then that almost all of them, except for Willy Brandt, did not represent German interests?
Keine deutschen Interessen vertreten. Ja, sie haben es vielleicht geglaubt, weil
Yeah, maybe they believed it because, well, not everyone really thought it through. I think Adenauer was too smart for that. He probably did think it through. But he also had other interests. He once said, "We're basically sitting here in the Siberian taiga," because Adenauer once remarked that the Siberian taiga begins just east of Magdeburg. He had a very Western way of thinking.
Und hat da sehr westlich gedacht. Also
Well, at the very least, everyone seems to have understood something different by German interests than I do. What do you mean by German interests?
Deutschen Interessen. Ja, Deutschland ist zunächst einmal Entität. Diese
Well, Germany is, first of all, an entity of its own. Its interests are, to begin with, independent. Of course, change through rapprochement and good neighborly relations are important, but naturally, Germany as a sovereign state has its own interests. Those interests point both east and west. They're about preserving our own social and economic system, about maintaining our way of life. They're about the prosperity of our citizens, and they're about peace. Germany, more than almost any other major country, has to work for peace, especially after the 20th century and given the situation we're still in today. Those, to me, are the key German interests that a country must represent, and not all allies do that. In fact, no ally represents German interests 100%. They represent their own. And that perspective was missing in most post-war chancellors, or if it was there, it was very well hidden.
Oder wenn denn da war sehr versteckt.
Is this a submission to transatlantic, specifically American interests?
Interessen? Ja, das Thema kam ja ein paar Mal auf.
Yeah, that topic has come up a few times, once with Willy Brandt and later again with the founding of the Green Party. The control of the transatlantic networks is, of course, very strong. The show Die Anstalt on ZDF did a very well-known segment about that back in 2014. Now, submission doesn't always happen consciously. It happens through framing, through brainwashing, through self-selection. Not everyone makes a deliberate gesture of submission. These kinds of attitudes develop over time, even among the elites. They take shape gradually. But of course, the Western victorious powers, and in the East, it was the other way around, worked from the very beginning to make sure that this mindset took hold, that this doctrine became firmly established.
Haltung entsteht, dass die Doktrin sich so gefestigt hat. NATO war absolut.
NATO was, I'd almost say, an absolutely core part of Germany's foreign policy doctrine. And then there's that quote from the first Secretary General, that NATO exists to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. People sometimes mention that as a joke, but of course that was one of its original founding purposes. There was, of course, the Cold War, and it wasn't, well, I think the tensions were real, and they came from both sides. And then there was the time I grew up in, when NATO also had a protective role. But it always did, really.
Schutz auch eine Schutzfunktion hatte, aber immer auch Schutz plus Machtprojektion.
Protection plus power projection on the part of the United States. Because the Supreme Commander is always American, and of course the nuclear weapons are under American command. So in case of doubt, in case of war, we would have been the auxiliary force. The doctrine, of course, was that there would be no war. The Bundeswehr was a peace army, a defense army. That was always stated in the Bundeswehr's white papers. And I also examine this shift in the domestic political debate in my dissertation, what happened between 1989 and 1995-96, when we rather quickly began sending Bundeswehr soldiers on foreign missions.
Bundeswehrsoldaten zu Auslandseinsätzen geschickt haben.
Verengt die transatlantische
Does the transatlantic influence narrow the intellectual scope of German elites? Or is it rather that intellectually limited elites go looking for a transatlantic mentor?
Eliten den transatlantischen Ziehvater suchen?
Ja, da müsste man jetzt in die
Well,
Soziologie,
to really get into that, we'd have to dive into the sociology of elite selection. But I think it was Napoleon who said that every soldier carries a marshal's baton in his knapsack if he's good enough. So how does elite selection actually work? Democracy is always mediated somehow through informal structures. The pure ideal of democracy doesn't really exist. It's an ideal we strive for. Let me start from the end. The current so-called elites, well, they've been selected, cast, and shaped in very specific ways. I'm thinking, for example, of a foreign minister. I don't think we've had that many female foreign ministers before. So it's actually pretty easy to identify what's going on there.
Kann man das relativ leicht dann identifizieren, aber so jemand hat für mich den Habitus eines
But someone like that, to me, has the manner of an eager class representative, or maybe a cultural affairs officer in some small third-tier town. Very diligent, very ambitious. You can see how that works in certain networks, in circles that are inflated with a lot of money and social prestige. Then people look around, see who might be suitable, and things move forward step by step. Let me give you an example from my own experience. From 1991, when I was a scholarship holder of the Adenauer Foundation, up until my expulsion in 2022, that happened because I made myself available as a candidate for the office of federal president. There aren't actually party candidates for that office. That's already part of how the Constitution is applied. The candidate for the presidency is nominated from within the Federal Assembly itself. The parties have taken that over. But later, when I was getting quite a bit of media attention, the Adenauer Foundation remembered, oh right, there's Professor Otte. So I got invited to give a few talks, including one in Kadnabia, where they have their conference center on Lake Como, the former retreat or vacation home of Konrad Adenauer. There was some networking going on, and at some point they realized, well, Professor Otte does his own thing, and he's good at it. There wasn't any direct offer or anything like that, but they noticed I wasn't showing much interest, and then the invitations stopped coming. So it's really a kind of casting process, a process of getting closer, of co-optation. And right now, we certainly don't have.
Und im Moment haben wir sicherlich nicht die Glücksten, die im Großen und Ganzen ausgesucht werden.
When representatives of the political elite seem to have stopped at the level of a child learning to speak, is that a sign of cultural and societal decay?
Des kulturellen, gesamtgesellschaftlichen Zerfalls.
Sowohl als auch. Es ist ein Zeichen des kulturellen Verfalls.
Both, really. It's a sign of cultural decline. I mean, the level of education is going down. There's not much to argue about there. But the other part is also a question of real power. How much power do I, as a politician, as a top German politician, still actually have? Or prestige, or whatever you want to call it. Back in the Weimar Republic, or in the old Federal Republic, a senior civil servant, say a state secretary, meant something. They lived decently, but they weren't rich. Still, there was social recognition, social respect for that position. That was already true in the imperial era. Anyway, today they're more like functionaries. The respect for the political class has largely disappeared. In return, they compensate themselves much more generously. And let's say certain kinds of talent still go into politics, but not the top talent anymore. Most of them do something else.
Does that also apply to the United States? You're both a German and an American citizen, and you've spent a lot of time studying the political system in the U.S.
Well, that's a different situation. The United States really dominates the West, and of course we have a completely different system. There can only ever be one president, that's clear. But if I'm a senator there, or if I achieve something in a government position, I naturally have very different opportunities and potential, simply because of the prominent role the United States plays. But the system itself is different. There was never that kind of career-based ministerial bureaucracy like we have in Germany. Instead, there's always been a very strong culture of lobbying in Congress.
Lobbyismus im Kongress. Insofern waren die
In that sense, senators and representatives were more dependent on their sponsors and donors than on their party. So parties don't play the same role they do in Germany. It's a completely different system. But overall, you find more talent there. And especially if you've held a government position, the path to Wall Street and into those networks is of course wide open. There's also that revolving door, from finance into politics and back again. For a while, I actually thought we needed something like that in Germany too, and I think one person who tried it was Jost Stolman during Gerhard Schröder's time.
Einer, der es mal probiert hat, war Jost Stolman bei Gerhard Schröder. Der ist ganz schnell wieder raus.
He was out again pretty quickly. He was an IT entrepreneur. We have a different kind of system. We used to have a ministerial bureaucracy that actually worked quite well, though of course it was also misused during the Third Reich, no question about that. Germans tend to have a certain respect for authority, but it was part of our system that we had this elite bureaucracy. That's all been watered down quite a bit. France has something similar, at least again since the Fifth Republic. And I think the ethos of public service, my father lived by that, and we're standing here in a historic place, a Prussian place. That ethos has been lost. It would do us a lot of good to have it back.
You used to argue in favor of supporting Donald Trump. Do you still do that today?
Ich zitiere mal aus einem Post auf X.
Let me quote something I saw on X. It said, and I'll translate it right away, "I'm still glad he is it, but boy am I disappointed." So I'm still glad he became president, but wow am I disappointed. I was one of the very early Trump supporters. I came out publicly back in 2016 or 2017, right after he first announced his candidacy. At the time, I spoke in front of about 500 or 600 people. Armin Wolf, your colleague, was there. At the Vienna Trade Fair. It was a financial conference. And I said, Donald Trump is my president of peace. He consistently spoke out against the deep state, against regime change, that is, replacing governments, against intelligence operations in other countries, and against those kinds of police actions.
Gegen diese Polizeiaktionen ausgesprochen. Ich erinnere an eine Pressekonferenz.
I remember a press conference he held in Berlin with the Italian President Mattarella present, where he said, "They want me to be at war all the time. I don't want that. I want the American military to be strong, but as a fighting force, not as a police force." And that was actually a consistent position all the way through. The other thing was, make America great again, meaning make sure the middle class, the lower middle class, and those who lost out because of globalization are doing better again. Those were very consistent positions. He stood by them in his first campaign, during his first term, and in the time in between, and now he's thrown it all overboard. That really is a disappointment.
Warum hat Donald Trump alles über Bord geworfen?
Why did Donald Trump throw everything overboard and start doing regime change operations like in Venezuela? At least that was the attempt, to kidnap the head of state and put someone else in charge. Has he taken over the position of the U.S. deep state, or are the Pentagon, the State Department, the CIA, and individual agencies acting on their own?
Machen sich die CIA einzelne Behörden selbstständig?
Muss es ja in gewisser Weise übernommen haben.
Well, he must have taken it on in some way. Otherwise, he wouldn't be representing that line publicly. The question is why and how he took it on. We can only speculate about that. So at some point, when the two of them weren't getting along very well, Elon Musk posted on X saying something like, "All right, time to bring out the big stick. Trump is in the Epstein files," and so on. As for Trump himself, I've always seen him as a marketing guy, a bit of a showman. I've admired his incredible resilience, his ability to stand firm even under the heaviest fire. I still admire that. It's almost superhuman. The man's pushing 80, and what he can endure is remarkable. I was over there for both of his inaugurations, and just the schedule over those 2 days was intense. So yes, it's impressive. He's a phenomenon. But at the end of the day, he's a marketing man, a businessman of the American kind. He knows a lot about bankruptcies, and quite a few people around him ended up poor because of those bankruptcies. He's always been good at marketing. He could also be flexible. I don't think, well, I can't read his mind, but I don't think he's a strategist. I think he's very convinced of himself, you can see that, and that he tends to just charge into a fight, throw something out there, see how it lands, and then adjust it afterward. As I said, the whole no foreign wars, fewer wars, peace, no regime change, that message came across pretty consistently for more than 8 years, and now that's gone. It could be that there are ways to tell him, all right, time to switch things up. But it could also be that he says, I can win there, I'll join in. We saw that in the dispute with Elon Musk. Musk was supposed to reform or review USAID with his Doge team, a group of young programmers. They were then attacked, and people started uncovering their cover names or online pseudonyms. One of them, I think, went by Big Dick, or whatever he called himself. I don't really know. No, that was all over the press because there was pushback. Then they found some completely absurd expenses, and USAID, the development aid agency, was shut down. That's actually the only thing Musk did. And you have to know that USAID was a CIA front, meaning a lot of those projects were of course meant to exert political influence inside those countries. What's left of it has now moved over to the State Department. And then probably after that, well, I mean, things got going pretty fast, and they could have kept going, but then it was shut down pretty quickly. And then Trump, basically overnight, together with top members of Congress, came up with the big beautiful bill, the budget bill, which adds about 5 or 6 trillion in new debt. So no more talk of paying down debt. The debt binge just keeps going. Now he's bumped the military budget from 1 trillion up to 1.5 trillion, pushing the deficit even higher. And maybe, on one hand, that pressure, that vulnerability, well, that's where Trump's weak spots might be. On the other hand, there's also that desire to be among the winners, to make compromises, and to keep people on his side. Just like when he brought Marco Rubio into his cabinet and started listening to Lindsey Graham, I think he thought, okay, let's move forward. I'll try something new. I can handle this, and I'll sell it afterward. Of course, that confidence also comes from his successes, from the incredible path he's taken. After the accusations following January 6th, 2021, the storming of the Capitol, he was gone. YouTube had banned him. Twitter, back then, had banned him too. His self-confidence has grown enormously since then, and now he can point to real successes.
Let me switch gears for a moment. I've got friends in the United States. When they want to show me the bars where Democrats hang out in Florida, we end up in restaurants for wealthy people. But when they want to show me the bars where Trump voters go, we're in places with auto mechanics, truck drivers, nurses, and cab drivers. Those are the people who voted for Trump in the U.S. Did he actually deliver for them?
No. And that's exactly the point. They were literally cheated out of their election. That's the foundation of the MAGA movement. Make America Great Again means focusing on the domestic economy, and that's how it looked during the first term. But Trump, like all American presidents, is very weak when it comes to domestic politics. That has to do with the constitution, with how the country is structured. So they quickly start looking for foreign policy successes. It's a general reflex, almost an imperial reflex. I was a professor at Boston University, just newly arrived, when an older colleague said to me, "Come on, let's go to the faculty room, the faculty bar, or whatever you call it. We're going to watch TV. Clinton's sending cruise missiles to Somalia."
Clinton schickt Cruise Missiles nach Somalia. Da hat also gerade gewisse Dinge mit einer.
So back then, he was having certain things going on with a certain intern. That whole affair with Monica Lewinsky. Even Clinton, and really everyone else, had that same kind of foreign policy reflex. You can see that now with Trump. And during his first term, it was like this. The Republicans said, cut taxes and the economy will take care of itself. At the start of Trump's first term, that actually worked. I didn't necessarily expect it at the time, but it did, at least when it came to the stock markets and so on. But now, those tools have been used up.
Die Mittel sind jetzt ausgereizt. Und der Big Beautiful Bill hat viel.
And the Big Beautiful Bill once again includes plenty of election giveaways for the rich. Wealth concentration is higher than ever. That's absurd. I mean, if you think about it, Elon Musk, who's one of the few who actually created real value, after his first two startups, which were in finance, said, "I want to build products. I want to create something real." He deliberately chose a different path. Now, Musk is a complex personality, of course, but you really have to admire the products he's created.
Die Vermögensverteilung ist so ungleich.
The distribution of wealth is so unequal that it no longer serves social peace. In 2018, a professor at the University of North Carolina published a book called The Broken Ladder. Inequality, of course, is a basic part of any society, and it can even be important. What matters is that people can still reach the next rung when they climb. But in today's society, in the United States and also in Germany, that's become impossible for many people. We've reached a level of inequality that's deeply harmful to society as a whole.
Gesamtgesellschaftlich sehr, sehr schädlich ist, und da hat Trump nicht geliefert.
Trump didn't deliver on that. There's extreme inequality. At the same time, about a third of Americans live at or below the poverty line. The country has deindustrialized because production has been outsourced mainly to China. Can Donald Trump really bring those jobs back?
Donald Trump Jobs zurückholen.
In begrenztem Umfang, ja. Also,
to a limited extent, yes. I mean, it's not going to be easy when you look at Apple and so on. Those phones would have to cost 2 or 3 times as much, and then the average American couldn't afford them anymore. So it's going to be very difficult. But he actually has a classic kind of industrial policy, almost in the sense of Friedrich List or Alexander Hamilton. In doing that, he's breaking with the overall global liberalization ideology of the post-war era and saying, we need to take care of our own industry. He wants to bring that back. He's basically a mercantilist. And then he puts pressure on other countries saying, come on, Biden started that too, even toward Germany. Come to us. Energy is much cheaper here.
Also through the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yes, it's the biggest subsidy program, much larger than what Trump has done now for the Greens. In fact, it's basically the largest Keynesian program in the U.S. since the post-war era, even bigger than what Trump is doing now with defense spending. He might succeed to some extent, but he's not going to restore America to its former greatness or dominance, because China now leads in many areas. They simply have a higher overall level of education. The infrastructure is there. Chinese foreign trade is expanding massively toward Asia, while trade with the U.S. has grown only about 4 to 5% over the past 5 years. Toward Asia, it's 30 to 80%. Sure, Trump might bring some jobs back, maybe at Europe's expense, that's the game, and at the expense of a few other countries. But he's not going to bring the country back to its old industrial strength.
The United States has taken on, and can continue to take on, enormous amounts of debt because the whole world needs dollars, especially for energy trade, for oil and gas. Can Trump keep that process going? Or to put it differently, does he have to reduce the debt burden?
Anders ausgedrückt, muss die Schuldenlast reduzieren.
Weder noch. Also er kann ihn nicht fortsetzen und er wird die
Neither.
Schuldenlast auch nicht
He can't
reduzieren
keep it
können,
going, and he won't be able to reduce the debt burden either.
Er kann's nicht fortsetzen,
He can't keep
weil
it going because we're in the middle of de-dollarization. The dollar makes up a smaller and smaller share of global trade. Even Saudi Arabia is doing part of its business without the dollar now. And there's a direct agreement between China and Brazil, which of course has an impact on the Western Hemisphere. Sanctions also run through SWIFT in Belgium and so on. So, the real loss of significance of the dollar is unavoidable.
unausweichlich. Das wird dadurch teilweise kompensiert.
That's partly offset by taking a much more extractive position toward Europe. Europe can hardly defend itself, so what happens is a transfer of wealth from Europe to the United States. For example, through the big internet companies that make their sales here, then shift their profits to the US, or at least to Ireland, and end up not being taxed in Europe. Now, from a tax policy standpoint, it would be a real break to start taxing revenues directly. But if I were an EU commissioner, and if there were a majority for it, I'd do it. Because basically the argument that the US pays too much for security, Trump was already making that back in 1988, in those full-page ads in the New York Times, when people were already speculating about his presidential ambitions. He was in his late 30s then, and he kept denying it. But even back then, he said, we have to make the others pay.
Wir müssen die anderen zahlen lassen. Die Staaten haben sich etwas geändert, damals waren es Mexiko.
The countries have changed a bit. Back then it was Mexico and Japan, now it's a few others. But basically, through troop deployment agreements and the dollar, we've been subsidizing the United States for decades. And now that's gone into overdrive, into fifth gear, I'd say. Take Nord Stream, for example. Now we're paying for expensive American fracking gas and so on. So in a way, we've become the main subsidizers of the US in Europe, because the global system just doesn't work the same way anymore.
Es eben global nicht mehr so funktioniert.
Is Donald Trump trying to gain control over resources, for example in Greenland, in Venezuela, or in Ukraine, in order to support the dollar as the world's leading currency?
Auch, also hat ja auch im Wahlkampf.
He also said again during the campaign that the dollar has to remain the world's leading currency, and that he'll make sure of it. But I think he's overestimating that a bit. Though, to be fair, he's always been focused on resources. The man's a real estate developer. He thinks in terms of territory and resources, and I do believe he genuinely wants what's best for America. But his approach is mercantilist, and in doing so, he's breaking apart the post-war order, the conventions we've had in how nations deal with each other since 1945. That's one part of it. But he'll only be able to preserve the dollar in that role within the American sphere of influence. If we look at the global map and see who's actually supporting the sanctions against Russia, it's North America, Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, and the rest of the world isn't. So within that American sphere, as I call it, he'll manage to do that. As for the rest, we'll have to see. The dollar will, of course, keep rising there.
Da wird der Dollar natürlich weiter eine wichtige Rolle spielen.
Experts from Russia, in particular, accuse the U.S. government of trying to hide part of its debt burden in cryptocurrencies. Is there any truth to that?
Ja, also anders als die.
So unlike the ECB in Europe or the EU that want a digital euro, which is a really hot and also dangerous topic, I want to sound a warning here. Back in 2016, I wrote a book about saving cash and against this whole move toward a cashless world. So they want the digital euro. Trump said the United States won't create central bank cryptos. That's why there are stablecoins. Those are private providers. That's the Anglo-Saxon tradition, outsourcing as much as possible to the private sector. And when these stablecoins, meaning cryptos from private providers, have to be backed by US Treasury bonds, then those cryptos get bought. The money gets cycled once through treasury bonds, and that at least creates new groups of buyers for government debt.
Schafft zumindest neue Käuferschichten für die Staatsanleihen.
Und das stabilisiert den Dollar.
And that does stabilize the dollar, at least for now, yes. How did the Chinese, who had been in close economic cooperation with Caracas, respond to the initiatives of the United States?
Vereinigten Staaten reagiert.
Bin jetzt kein China-Experte, aber ich sehe.
I'm not a China expert, but I can clearly see that the Chinese are massively reducing their dollar holdings, meaning U.S. government bonds. In just the last 3 to 4 years, they've cut their bond holdings in half, from about 1.2 trillion down to 600 billion. That's now only about 5% of China's GDP. So in effect, they've already moved out of the dollar. Instead, they're buying raw materials. Gold, around 1,600 tons a year, even though China itself is the world's largest gold producer. They're also buying oil, copper, and coal. China is one of the biggest coal producers as well. So they're basically turning those worthless dollars, those worthless American bonds, into commodities. They've built up a large strategic reserve, which China needs because it's still dependent, and key routes through the South China Sea could be cut off. But China is preparing for a world that continues to break apart economically.
Die Welt wirtschaftlich weiter zerfällt.
Will Donald Trump versuchen,
Donald Trump might try to gain better access to rare earths by reshaping global spheres of influence. For example, I'm thinking that a closer relationship with Moscow could also mean exporting rare earths from Central Asia through Vladivostok.
Mittelasien über Vladivostok exportieren kann.
Es gab in der amerikanischen
In the American foreign policy elite, over the past 10 or 15 years, there have basically been two camps. One group was on a collision course with Russia, but there was also a significant minority who kept saying, that's a mistake. We need Russia later on to position ourselves against China. I mean, that's just, well, that's the mindset of a world power that's gotten used to it. They want to be number one. That's something deeply rooted in America. When I started my PhD in Princeton back in 1989, the big worry was, when will Japan overtake us? And now the concern is China. And I have to say, we as Germans don't ask ourselves those kinds of questions.
Und ich meine, diese Fragen stellen wir uns als Deutsche nicht. Wir sind zwar stolz, wenn wir irgendwo mal Nummer 1 waren.
We're proud, of course, when we've been number one somewhere, even if that happens less often now, and we work hard for it. But seeing it as a threat when someone else becomes number one, that's really a kind of paranoid great power attitude. I see a bit of that in China too, but there it's much more strategic, much more coordinated. So these two camps, the one leaning toward Russia and the one favoring confrontation, right now, the pro-Russia side has the upper hand, especially with Trump, who's always been that way and basically looked for a good relationship there. We'll have to see how far that rapprochement goes. And of course, that also means that access to strategic minerals in the Donbass might become a bit cheaper again.
Hat der Krieg in
Has the war in Ukraine made the West stronger or weaker? We need to get started now.
Jetzt müssen wir anfangen, was ist der Westen? Ich habe nie an
Nehmen wir mal NATO, die
What is the West really? I never quite believed in, well, let's take NATO's strategy, for example. Yeah. To me, that's kind of vague. I never really bought into this whole myth of the West, not even when I was young. When I was stationed with the Bundeswehr in Lüneburg, I would have had to shoot at my own brothers across the border. And even back then, that didn't sit right with me. But let's look at what the West is supposed to be. The war in Ukraine has seriously weakened Europe and strengthened America. So overall, maybe the West as a whole is still about equally strong, but it's definitely created a major geopolitical fault line.
Es war wirklich eine geopolitische Bruchlinie. Mit dem Ukraine-Krieg ist der Liberalismus.
With the war in Ukraine, liberalism has come to an end, at least in foreign policy. It was already being questioned before that. We're now living in a new world with new rules. Market mercantilism is back. We're seeing new blocks forming. I actually predicted that back in 2019, and in my book, The Crash is Coming, from 2006, I said we're heading into an era of deglobalization. It's written right there. That was a bold statement at the time. Because back then, everyone was still saying everything would just keep getting more global. The world is flat. Thomas Friedman from the New York Times.
New York Times. wir sind jetzt in einer Phase großer Unruhe und
We're now in a period of major unrest, and the war in Ukraine has clearly weakened Europe, and the EU as well. The EU has been trying to push back against that, and until just a few weeks ago, it was doing so with a deliberately more confrontational stance. Our EU leaders basically saw it as the Union's job to take over the Western role in the Ukraine war if the United States were to pull back. But even that is starting to crumble. I'm curious to see how that develops. What seems likely, though, is that we'll be facing a United States that's actually stronger, not financially, but in terms of foreign policy influence, and a Europe that's much weaker.
Treffen und ein sehr geschwächtes Europa.
Die Verhandlungsdelegationen aus Moskau und
The negotiating teams from Moscow and Washington are also talking about launching joint projects in the Arctic. They're discussing using the frozen Russian assets in the West, at least in part, for rebuilding Ukraine, but also for joint projects between Moscow and Washington. They're even talking about reactivating the Nord Stream pipeline through a joint consortium. That would mean they could shut off the gas to us in Europe at any time. How promising does that sound?
Wie vielversprechend ist das?
Ja, für Europa ist das erst einmal.
Well, for Europe, and especially for Nord Stream, this isn't exactly great news. I mean, German money went into it. Russian money, too. It's a German-Russian project. And if America now takes it over as spoils of war, that basically means an extra tax on Germany. Maybe that's better than nothing, but it's still pretty embarrassing. Trump once said that Canada should really be part of the United States, and there's not much substance behind that. Pretty early in his presidency, or maybe just before it, he said something like, "I want to get along well with Putin and Xi. They're real statesmen, but Canada should belong to us."
Das sind echte Staatsmänner, aber Kanada sollte zu uns. Und er verachtet, glaube ich, unsere europäischen.
I think he despises our European heads of state and government. You can really see that in this symbolic image where they're sitting in front of his desk in the Oval Office, like a school class on little chairs, and he's lecturing them from behind the desk. He's not interested in them at all. What he's after are deals. He plays one against the other. That kind of thing happened before too, but it used to be much more hidden, much more secretive. Now it's all out in the open.
Versteckter und heimlicher und heute geht's ganz offen.
In der neuen amerikanischen Sicherheitsstrategie.
The new American security strategy assumes a multipolar world. There are other centers of power besides Washington. Washington is no longer the world's hegemon. There are others now, partly Moscow, but above all Beijing. So are the territories being redrawn, and are the vassals in those territories being kept on a tighter leash?
Und die Vasallen in den Claims härter an die Kandare genommen.
Ja, also
Yes, we can see that very clearly in Europe. This tougher approach, the idea that others can be asked to pay more because they're economically stronger, that's what's happening. We've always been the ones asked to foot the bill. Anything else, in my view, just isn't accurate. But that's especially true when it comes to the United States. China has to take a different path, since it doesn't have that kind of military power. China invests a huge share of its surpluses, and of course that gives it influence. Yes, the world is reorganizing, but more in a bipolar way. China and the US with a few sovereign subcenters. Russia is sovereign, but economically it's not on the same level as those two centers. The Monroe Doctrine is being brought back into play.
Die Monroe-Doktrin wird wieder hervorgeholt, sehr verstärkt, die war eigentlich immer.
Much more strongly now, though it's actually always been in effect. It basically says that no other power should play a role in our Latin American backyard.
Das hat James Monroe so gesagt.
That's what James Monroe said. But what it didn't include was the idea that you can just replace governments whenever you want. And that's been the case for at least 120 years. I'm thinking of a situation, if I remember correctly, it was Panama around 1908 or so. When the Marines were sent in, they occupied the customs houses until the debt was paid off, and then they pulled out again.
Is the war in Ukraine becoming a new original catastrophe for Europe?
Es ist schwierig zu sagen. Er hat
It's hard to say. He definitely set in motion this shift in the world order, the end of the liberal world order. He started the end, the reorganization of the world. In my book, World System Crash, published in 2019, I outlined 3 scenarios, on page 398 if I may mention that. One of them was this bipolar setup, a new Cold War between China and the United States, with a few secondary centers. Back then, I said the status of India and Russia was still open. And even with India, you can see there's a certain move toward China, partly because of the sanctions policy and the rather unpredictable politics, which have created a healthy mistrust, even toward their ally, the United States. There's still a lot that's uncertain. For me, a bipolar world was always the most likely scenario. The other option would have been a multipolar world, Europe, the Western Hemisphere, the US, and China. But even back then, I said the chances of that were very low, and now they're even lower. So, I don't have an optimistic outlook for Europe. Who's going to end up paying the price for the war in Ukraine? It really looks like Europe will. And of course, Germany will be the main contributor. What kind of costs are we looking at? What's your estimate? It's very hard to say. And if I can briefly come back to the financial side, the United States will never pay back its debts either. Other Western industrial nations will never pay back their debts either. There will either be currency reforms or negotiated deals where debts are frozen, put on hold for 100 years, and interest payments are suspended. And that, in a way, is also a form of debt repayment. Today, with much more refined control mechanisms, it's even possible to push certain players into insolvency. That destroys wealth too. We'll see how it plays out. Financially speaking, the bill has, in a sense, already been paid. Every tank we send over, every Leopard, those are made here. And that means somewhere else. Something wasn't produced for consumption. There might be financial claims tied to that, but they don't come back. The real bill is something else. The real bill is the destruction of German infrastructure, the destruction of German industry, because of high costs, high energy prices, and a lot of other factors. And unfortunately, in recent years, we've come a long way down that road, well past halfway. We're in a steep decline. And I always say, if a government could at least manage to turn that crash into a rough landing, that alone would already be quite an achievement.
How can that happen? How can we soften the hard landing? Because with this generation of politicians, you almost have to call it that, when they hit the ground of reality.
Yes, reopening Nord Stream. That's obviously about energy. I'm also a supporter of nuclear power, within reason. We had the cleanest nuclear energy in the world. All over the world, new nuclear plants are being built, while we're blowing ours up. That was a top-level technology, a German one. We were also leading in environmental technology. So that's the first point. But these are really questions about production conditions, about a kind of policy. I've mentioned Friedrich List before, the kind of policy that made Germany strong in the 19th century. We had hardly any natural resources, just coal and steel. But we had a well-educated population, a hard-working population. We had legal certainty and a very solid legal framework. Our legal framework has also become Americanized. After 1989, we actually had another chance to export the continental European legal system eastward. But Kohl and his generation didn't do that. And since we never really had a foreign policy in that sense, countries like England, France, the US, and many others had a clear strategy, while Germany didn't. In Germany, the political and economic spheres have always been very separate. So restoring legal certainty, returning to some of the good old traditions, supporting cooperatives and small and medium-sized businesses, that's really a task for generations. That's why I say, at best, this can be the starting point. You hit the ground first, and rebuilding from there is a whole different story.
Will the EU survive? It's changed from what was once at least proclaimed to be a peace project into a war machine.
in eine Kriegsmaschinerie.
Das war ja oder ist die Hoffnung.
That was, or still is, the hope of our current heads of government, to redefine themselves through that. I mean, the whole spending policy is basically aimed at state intervention, just like Trump is doing. We're moving back toward Keynesianism, toward a partly managed economy, something we've seen since the early 1980s. That's the hope of some political elites. I hope it doesn't go that far. But for that to happen, the other thing has to come first, that the economic outlook really turns very bleak, and that we simply no longer have the means to do it. And then maybe something new will emerge.
Will the European Union take in Ukraine in any way?
The likelihood is relatively high. I believe even Putin and Trump didn't object to it, or at least Putin agreed, as far as I can still tell. So I assume that the next strain or pressure will be added there as well. Of course, that can't be predicted with absolute certainty.
If the current generation of politicians has led us into this war and brought Germany to the brink of an economic disaster, do we then need a change of elites?
Well, how do you even do something like that? It can really only happen more or less naturally, because the Western European elites, well, you have to say it, were mostly bourgeois elites. The nobility, at least the political part of it, was in opposition to Hitler, or at least agitated against him. The old industrial elites in the West also managed to hold on for a while. But they're gone now. You have to say Germany Inc. was dismantled by Gerhard Schröder, Joschka Fischer, and also Oscar Lafontaine. I didn't bring it up with him, but there were a few laws passed back then that unfortunately set that whole process in motion. Back then, you couldn't really grasp the full scale of it. You have to give the people involved credit for that. So, how do you actually bring about a change in the elites? I mean, in England, there's been continuity for centuries, in the United States too. But in Germany, we've had several breaks. So where is that change supposed to come from now? And the political elites in Germany, they often grew up with this international narrative. Maybe after a hard economic landing, new perspectives will emerge. Right now, I don't see where that could come from.
An economic hard landing could also lead to social crises, even to internal unrest. How do you assess that?
We brought these internal disturbances on ourselves through mass migration. And of course, that also works as a convenient tool of control. When there's unrest inside the country, it's easier to shape things from above. I was actually quite shocked recently. Well, it was the first time in a while that I saw something violent. I was at Cologne Central Station the day before yesterday, and right outside the station, as far as I could tell, there was a Kurdish demonstration. The Kurds, who were long loyal allies of the West, are now being abandoned in favor of an al-Qaeda terrorist who's suddenly being courted. The unrest is coming, but the real strain, well, that's mostly on German retirees and the German middle class, and they're not exactly young anymore. So unrest tends to come more from young people, from young men, and those are the ones who've been brought into the country. So I don't really see any revolutionary potential among Germans themselves. Even if Germany keeps getting poorer, I still don't see that potential for revolution among the German people.
Is the majority of Germans heading for disaster?
Ja, ob's Dösen ist, ich glaube, in solchen unsicheren und komplexen Zeiten, wo uns auch nie das geopolitische oder auch das Rüstzeug gegeben wurde und auch jetzt nicht gegeben wird, sondern durch Propaganda, durch lückenhafte Darstellung, durch Fehldarstellung eben auch falsche Bilder vermittelt werden. Ich glaube, man döst nicht, sondern die Mehrheit ist, ja, zum Teil döst sie, aber zum Teil ist sie auch auf falsche Feindbilder eingeschworen, denn der Mensch sucht sich ja in solchen Situationen auch Schuldige oder sucht sich Dinge, an denen man sich reiben kann, und so wie sich die Mehrheit an den Querdenkern und Covidioten gerieben hat, reibt man sich jetzt an anderen Dingen. Also diese Emotionalisierung ist ja auch Teil einer solchen Phase, aber eben Emotionalisierung als Instrumentalisierung für falsche Zwecke.
Would it make sense to pursue new transatlantic partnerships, for example, with the BRICS countries, with China, or even to rethink our relationship with Russia? Of course, Germany as a...
Also Deutschland ist als Land in der Mitte Europas, es ist natürlich nicht
A country in the middle of Europe. Of course, it's not easy when it comes to our European neighbors. That's completely clear. But it's the only real chance we have to pursue a diplomacy of balance, of peace, in all directions, and maybe also to free ourselves from some of the old systems. For example, in Europe, it would be really important to revive the OSCE.
Ganz wichtig, die OSZE wieder zu beleben.
Professor Max Otte fordert
Professor Max Otte is calling for a new policy of balance in Germany. He fears a hard crash and says he's disappointed in Donald Trump. Thank you for that. Here on Against the Current, we show you viewpoints and perspectives the propaganda media keep hidden. Stay with us.
welche die Propagandamedien verschweigen. Bleiben Sie dabei.